welcome back. Tonight, we're descending slowly into the complete timeline of Outlast, a world where corporate ambition twisted into unspeakable horror, where the pursuit of power over the human mind shattered countless lives across decades of calculated cruelty, and where the darkness of experimentation left scars that echo through abandoned asylums and isolated compounds. From the classified origins of the Murkoff Corporation during the Cold War's paranoid heights, through the nightmare of Mount Massive Asylum and its tortured inhabitants, to the religious extremism of Temple Gate and the sinister trials conducted in the depths of secret facilities, we'll trace every shadow, every victim, every calculated atrocity that defines this universe of descent into madness. This is the story of how governments and corporations weaponized human suffering, how innocence was corrupted into violence, and how those who sought truth found only horror waiting in the dark. Whether you're discovering these details for the first time, letting familiar terrors wash over you like a dark lullaby, or simply allowing the narrative to carry you toward sleep's embrace, this will guide you through the unbroken chronology of Outlast's world. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of deep, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a fever dream. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how these dark tales reach across the world, one quiet night at a time. Let's begin. Long before Miles Upshur raised his camera in the shadow of Mount Massive Asylum, before Blake Langerman stumbled into the madness of Temple Gate, the seeds of Outlast's horrors were planted in the paranoid soil of Cold War America, where government agencies pursued victory through any means necessary, even if those means involved breaking the human mind itself. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, as the United States emerged from World War II into an ideological struggle with the Soviet Union, intelligence agencies became obsessed with the concept of mind control, driven by fears that communist nations had developed techniques to reprogram captured soldiers and extract classified information through psychological manipulation. These anxieties manifested in programs like Project MKUltra, the Central Intelligence Agency's umbrella initiative for mind control research that would span decades and consume countless unwitting subjects in its quest to master human consciousness. The project began with captured Nazi scientists during Operation Paperclip, men who had conducted their own brutal experiments in concentration camps, their expertise too valuable to waste despite their crimes, and their knowledge formed the foundation for America's own descent into unethical experimentation. As MKUltra expanded through the months, it encompassed approximately 150 separate research projects conducted at universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies across North America, most without the subject's knowledge or consent, exploring everything from hypnosis and sensory deprivation to the administration of LSD and other psychoactive substances in attempts to discover methods of controlling human behavior and extracting information from resistant subjects. Within this broader context of government-sponsored experimentation, the Murkoff Corporation emerged from the shadows in the late 1950s, founded as a contractor providing research services to government agencies seeking to push the boundaries of psychological manipulation beyond what official facilities could publicly undertake. In its earliest incarnation, Murkoff operated as a shell company with modest facilities, taking on projects that more established institutions refused, experiments that required complete secrecy and absolute moral flexibility. The corporation's founders understood that while governments had deep pockets and desperate needs, they also required distance from the actual work, a buffer that would protect political figures from accountability should operations be exposed. And Murkoff positioned itself as that essential buffer, the entity willing to descend into darkness so others could maintain their public facades. Initial contracts focused on interrogation techniques, studies of how pain and fear could be used to break resistance, building on methods developed during wartime but refining them with the cold precision of scientific methodology. documenting thresholds of human endurance and mapping the psychological breaking points that transformed defiant subjects into compliant informants. As the 1960s arrived, Murkoff expanded its operations, acquiring small psychiatric facilities and prisons where they could conduct long-term studies on captive populations, individuals society had already marginalized, whose disappearances or deteriorations would raise few questions, perfect subjects for experiments that required months or years to complete. The corporation's breakthrough came in the mid-1960s when researchers stumbled upon something unexpected during experiments with sensory deprivation and electromagnetic stimulation at a facility in rural Colorado. A subject exposed to specific frequencies of electromagnetic radiation while under extreme psychological stress exhibited behaviors that suggested not merely compliance or breakdown, but a fundamental alteration in consciousness, responding to commands with an immediacy that bypassed normal cognitive processing, as if the barrier between thought and action had dissolved entirely. Dr. Rudolf Wernicke, a German scientist whose past involvement with Nazi medical experiments had been quietly erased from official records in exchange for his expertise, recognized the significance immediately. What they had discovered wasn't just a method of control, but the ability to override human will entirely, to transform individuals into biological machines whose thoughts and actions could be directed with the precision of computer programming. Wernicke's theories, which he called the Morphogenic Engine concept, proposed that specific electromagnetic frequencies could interact with the brain's electrical activity in ways that fundamentally rewired neural pathways through direct manipulation of the bioelectric substrate of consciousness itself. The implications excited Murkoff's leadership and their government sponsors, promising applications in espionage, warfare, and domestic control that would give the United States an insurmountable advantage in the Cold War's shadow battles. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, as America tore itself apart over Vietnam and civil rights, as students protested and cities burned, Murkoff quietly expanded its research into the Morphogenic Engine program, constructing new facilities in isolated locations and funneling subjects from prisons, psychiatric hospitals, and the streets through arrangements with corrupt officials who understood that some people simply wouldn't be missed. The experiments grew more sophisticated and more brutal, testing not just the engine's capacity to control but to transform, exposing subjects to prolonged electromagnetic bombardment while simultaneously subjecting them to psychological trauma designed to break down existing personality structures, creating blank slates upon which new directives could be written. Dr. Wernicke emerged as the program's visionary. His cold German precision combined with a complete absence of ethical constraints, making him invaluable to Murkoff's ambitions, and his theories evolved beyond simple control into something approaching the creation of a new type of human being. Individuals whose consciousness had been so thoroughly restructured by the engine's influence that they existed in a state between human and machine. Test subjects who survived the initial exposures displayed disturbing characteristics. Vacant expressions broken by sudden violent outbursts when triggered by specific stimuli. Their personalities fractured into fragments that could be activated and deactivated like switches, their memories confused and overlapping, unable to distinguish their own experiences from implanted suggestions, living nightmares trapped in bodies that no longer fully belonged to them. As the 1970s progressed and public awareness of MKUltra grew following congressional investigations, with senators expressing outrage and newspapers publishing exposés about government mind control experiments, Murkoff found itself in an increasingly precarious position, no longer able to operate with the same freedom under direct government contracts now subject to oversight and scrutiny. The corporation adapted by privatizing its operations, maintaining connections with intelligence agencies through informal channels and shell companies, but increasingly funding its research through other means. Partnerships with pharmaceutical companies testing new psychoactive compounds, contracts with private security firms seeking interrogation techniques, and even arrangements with foreign governments whose own ethical standards proved even more flexible than America's had been. The Morphogenic Engine research continued in this new environment, sheltered from public view by layers of corporate obfuscation and protected by the simple fact that its true nature seemed too fantastic for credible exposure. In 1978, Murkoff acquired a massive facility in the mountains of Colorado, a former tuberculosis hospital that had fallen into disuse, designated as Mount Massive Asylum in official records. This would become Murkoff's flagship facility, the place where all their research threads would converge, where the morphogenic engine would finally be perfected. The asylum's renovation began immediately, retrofitting the sprawling complex with laboratories, holding cells, observation rooms, and most importantly, the massive underground chambers that would house the engine itself, a cathedral of technology dedicated to the violation of human consciousness. As renovation progressed, Murkoff began transferring subjects from their scattered facilities across the country, consolidating their research population in Mount Massive's reinforced wings, hundreds of individuals whose fates had already been sealed the moment they entered Murkoff's custody. The asylum opened officially in 1980, presenting itself to the limited outside scrutiny as a progressive psychiatric hospital using cutting-edge therapeutic techniques, while in reality, its basement levels and restricted wings housed horrors that eclipsed anything the public could imagine. Patients strapped to tables while the engine's electromagnetic pulses tore through their minds, their screams absorbed by soundproofed walls, their suffering documented in clinical reports that reduced human agony to data points and statistical analysis. Dr. Wernicke established his primary laboratory in Mount Massive's underground complex, surrounding himself with the engine's machinery and a carefully selected staff of researchers who shared his vision, or at least his willingness to ignore conscience in pursuit of scientific advancement. The doctor's methods grew increasingly extreme as he pursued what he called full morphogenic saturation, exposing subjects to the engine's influence for days or weeks at a time while systematically destroying their existing psychological frameworks through combinations of drugs, torture, and psychological manipulation designed to leave them completely vulnerable to reprogramming. Some subjects died in the process, their brains unable to withstand the assault. Massive hemorrhages or complete psychological collapse, leaving them vegetative or deceased. Casualties that Murkoff's records dismissed as acceptable losses in the pursuit of breakthrough results. Others survived but emerged as something less than human, their personalities so thoroughly shattered that they could no longer form coherent thoughts, existing in states of constant terror or complete dissociation, lost in internal landscapes that bore no relationship to reality. A few, a very few, seemed to achieve something approximating what Wernicke sought. Individuals who responded to commands with perfect obedience, who could perform complex tasks without hesitation or questioning, who seemed to have lost all capacity for independent will while retaining functionality. Through the 1980s, as Ronald Reagan's America celebrated military buildup and economic expansion, as the Cold War entered its final phase with the Soviet Union's slow collapse, Mount Massive Asylum continued its work in terrible secrecy, accumulating hundreds of patients whose official diagnoses and treatments bore no relationship to the experimentation they actually endured. Wernicke's staff expanded, bringing in specialists in neurology, psychology, and electromagnetic theory, many of them brilliant minds whose ethics had been compromised by ambition or ideology. The engine itself evolved through multiple iterations, each version more powerful and more precise, able to target specific brain regions with its electromagnetic pulses, attempting to achieve the surgical precision that would allow reliable reprogramming without the vegetative failures and psychotic breaks that plagued earlier attempts. Patient files from this era document a parade of suffering. Individuals admitted with minor psychiatric conditions or even no conditions at all, simply vulnerable people whose disappearances wouldn't prompt investigation, subjected to the engine's influence until they became unrecognizable. In 1993, a development occurred that would prove crucial to Outlast's ultimate nightmare, though its significance wouldn't become clear for years. Among Mount Massive's patient population, a man named Father Martin Archambaud arrived, officially committed for delusional disorder with religious themes, a failed priest who claimed to receive visions from God and believed himself chosen for a sacred mission. Martin's file indicated a history of instability within the Catholic Church, his increasingly bizarre sermons and behavior leading to his removal from active ministry. Instead of finding peace, Martin became another subject for Wernicke's experiments, exposed to the engine's influence as part of a cohort studying electromagnetic effects on religiously oriented cognition. The researchers, curious whether strong pre-existing belief structures would prove more resistant to morphogenic saturation than typical psychological frameworks. What they discovered was unexpected and would prove catastrophic. Father Martin's religious convictions, rather than being overwritten by the engine's influence, seemed to merge with it, his visions intensifying rather than diminishing, his sense of divine mission expanding to encompass the engine itself, which he began to perceive as an instrument of God's will, a tool for the purification and transformation that he believed humanity desperately needed. The engine's effects on Martin created something Wernicke had never seen before, not a broken subject or an obedient puppet, but a true believer whose faith had been twisted into apocalyptic certainty, someone who embraced the very process that destroyed others. Martin's transformation troubled some of Wernicke's staff, who noted his growing influence over other patients. His ability to communicate despite the engine's supposed suppression of personality, his charismatic appeals to suffering individuals who found comfort in his religious framework for understanding their torment. The priest began organizing secret worship services in hidden corners of the asylum, gathering followers from among the patient population, individuals whose minds had been damaged but not destroyed, who clung to Martin's promises of purpose and salvation amid their captivity. Wernicke, observing this development, saw not a problem but an opportunity, hypothesizing that Martin's ability to maintain coherent identity despite full morphogenic saturation might offer insights into creating more stable and functional subjects, that the key wasn't eliminating personality but channeling it through new frameworks that could coexist with the engine's influence. Further experiments on Martin ensued. Increased exposures meant to document the limits of his resilience, these sessions only deepening Martin's conviction that he had been chosen for something extraordinary. In 1997, Dr. Rudolf Wernicke died at age 76, suffering a massive stroke in his laboratory while reviewing data from the latest round of engine experiments, his last words reportedly expressing frustration that he wouldn't see the program's final perfection, the realization of his vision for complete morphogenic control. His death created a vacuum at Mount Massive, removing the driving force that had guided the engine program for decades, leaving behind a facility full of damaged patients and researchers unsure how to proceed without their guiding vision. Murkoff's leadership faced a decision: shut down the increasingly expensive and ethically problematic program that had never quite achieved its promised results despite decades of work, or find new direction that could justify continued operation. Corporate pragmatism won, Murkoff deciding that the investment in Mount Massive and the potential applications of morphogenic technology remained too valuable to abandon. The corporation promoted Dr. Rick Traeger to a leadership position, a psychiatrist whose files showed disturbing enthusiasm for the program's methods, someone who seemed to enjoy the power dynamics of experimentation. As the new millennium approached, Mount Massive entered a period of relative stability under its new management structure, the engine experiments continuing, but with less ambition than Wernicke's grand visions, focused more on incremental improvements and documentation of long-term effects on the aging patient population, some of whom had been in Murkoff's custody for 2 decades or more. Father Martin remained among these long-term patients, his influence in the facility having grown to the point where he essentially led a religious movement within the asylum's walls, his followers numbering in dozens, patients who saw him as prophet and protector. Facility staff tolerated this development, some even finding it useful as Martin's influence helped maintain order among patients who might otherwise have been completely unmanageable. In 2003, Murkoff's operations expanded beyond Mount Massive with the acquisition of another facility, this one located in the Arizona desert, designated for a new initiative called the Morphogenic Enhancement Project, building on decades of engine research but incorporating advances in genetic engineering and pharmaceutical intervention. This facility would focus on creating subjects from the beginning, rather than attempting to reprogram existing adults using children and adolescents whose developing brains might prove more malleable to morphogenic influence, a program that represented Murkoff's darkest evolution. The systematic destruction of innocence in pursuit of the perfect controllable subject. The Arizona facility sourced its subjects from the margins of society, orphans and runaways and children seized from families deemed unfit by corrupted social workers on Murkoff's payroll, small lives that vanished into the corporation's custody with minimal documentation. Results proved promising from Murkoff's perspective, children exposed to morphogenic influence during critical developmental windows showing higher rates of successful integration than adult subjects, though success meant the creation of profoundly damaged individuals whose entire psychological structures had been warped by forces they couldn't understand or resist. The Arizona facility's most significant subject was a young girl named Jessica who had survived a car accident that killed her parents, whose subsequent trauma and hospitalization brought her to Murkoff's attention through their network of compromised social workers and medical professionals. Jessica underwent years of engine exposure at what Murkoff called Temple Gate School, her developing brain subjected to electromagnetic manipulation during critical windows of neural formation, the results seeming promising initially as she exhibited the controllability and stability that Murkoff sought. But Jessica's case proved ultimately to be another failure, her engine-sculpted psyche developing latent instabilities that manifested as she reached adolescence, episodes of dissociation and altered perception that suggested the morphogenic integration had created fractures rather than stable control, her consciousness thus fragmenting under stresses that normal development would have weathered. Jessica's case intersected with another Murkoff project when the corporation arranged for Blake and Lynn Langerman to visit Temple Gate School in 2003, the couple both working as educators interested in reform approaches to troubled youth. Their tour of the facility presented as part of Murkoff's public relations effort to maintain the school's legitimate facade. During the visit, Blake witnessed something that would haunt him for years. A priest named Loudermilch taking Jessica from her classroom, the girl's terrified resistance ignored as the priest dragged her toward private areas. Blake's intervention blocked by staff members who explained this was a scheduled therapy session that shouldn't be disrupted. Their casual dismissal of Jessica's distress striking Blake as deeply wrong even as his professional position and lack of authority prevented him from pressing the confrontation. What Blake didn't witness, but what Jessica endured in Loudermilch's therapy sessions, represented some of Temple Gate School's darkest abuses, the priest using his position to sexually assault various students under the guise of spiritual counseling, his crimes enabled by Murkoff staff who either didn't know or didn't care what happened in the private sessions they arranged. The situation reached its terrible conclusion when Jessica, during one of Loudermilch's assaults, experienced a massive psychotic break, her engine-damaged mind fracturing completely under the trauma, and in that moment of total psychological collapse, something happened that witnesses struggled to explain coherently in their later statements. Jessica fell or jumped from a window in the facility's upper floor, her body plummeting to the ground below. Whether she was fleeing from Loudermilch or simply dissociating completely from reality remained unclear. Her death ruled accidental, despite circumstances suggesting either suicide or foul play. Murkoff's influence ensuring that investigations never pushed beyond superficial conclusions. Blake Langerman, having departed Temple Gate School hours before Jessica's death, learned of it later through news reports that provided minimal details, the incident triggering guilt that would fester for years. His sense that he should have done more to protect the girl. By 2009, Mount Massive Asylum had become a haunted place even beyond its surface horrors, decades of suffering soaked into its walls. The accumulated psychic weight of countless ruined lives creating an atmosphere that disturbed even hardened staff members. The engine continued its work in the underground levels, its electromagnetic pulses maintaining the morphogenic state in subjects whose brains had become dependent on its influence, who would collapse into seizures or comas if removed from its range for extended periods, trapped in biological dependence on the very system that had destroyed them. New admissions slowed as Murkoff shifted focus to other facilities and research directions, but Mount Massive's existing population remained, too valuable as long-term study subjects to release. In 2012, a significant development arrived at Mount Massive in the form of a new patient, a man named Billy Hope, who came from Murkoff's Arizona facility, a subject whose childhood had been consumed by the Morphogenic Enhancement Project's experiments, who had been raised inside the program from age 7, his entire adolescence shaped by engine exposure. Billy represented the culmination of decades of research, someone whose neural development had occurred entirely under Murkoff's influence, whose consciousness had never known normalcy but had been constructed from the beginning according to the corporation's designs. What they didn't fully understand was that Billy Hope had evolved beyond anything Wernicke had imagined. That the combination of childhood engine exposure and his particular neurology had created something unprecedented, a consciousness that didn't just respond to morphogenic influence but could project it, his mind generating its own electromagnetic patterns that affected others, making him less a subject than a living engine whose thoughts could reshape reality for those around him through mechanisms that defied explanation. Billy's arrival disturbed Mount Massive's equilibrium immediately, his presence affecting other patients in ways that suggested his morphogenic field extended beyond his body, that proximity to him intensified their own engine-induced conditions, made their hallucinations more vivid, their altered states more extreme. Father Martin, encountering Billy during the new patient's orientation, experienced what he described as a vision of terrible clarity, a revelation that convinced him that Billy was the chosen instrument of the apocalypse he had been prophesying for years, that the young man represented the culmination of all suffering in Mount Massive, the vessel through which divine purification would finally arrive. Martin began organizing his followers in preparation for what he called the gospel, a coming transformation that Billy's presence had made imminent, stockpiling supplies in hidden areas of the facility, preparing for an event he couldn't fully articulate, but believed with absolute certainty was approaching. Researchers studying Billy quickly realized they had something extraordinary and terrifying in their custody. His brain scans showing activity patterns that shouldn't be possible. Electromagnetic emissions that exceeded anything the engine itself produced. Dr. Traeger, now firmly in control of Mount Massive's operations, saw in Billy the opportunity to finally achieve everything Murkoff had sought, proposing a new series of experiments that would push Billy's abilities to their limits, treating him not as a human being, but as a phenomenon to be mapped and exploited. As 2013 arrived, tensions within Mount Massive reached critical levels, the combination of Billy Hope's disturbing influence and decades of accumulated horrors creating conditions that felt increasingly unstable. Father Martin's preparations intensified, his sermons to followers growing more explicit about the coming transformation, about how Billy would serve as the catalyst for their liberation. Some staff members noticed these preparations, reported concerns about potential unrest, but Mount Massive's management dismissed the warnings, fundamentally underestimating both Martin's organizational abilities and the desperate fury of people who had endured decades of torture with no hope of justice or escape. In early September 2013, everything changed when a massive security failure occurred during a routine transport of Billy Hope between laboratory facilities, the young man suffering a seizure that overwhelmed the guards escorting him, his morphogenic field spiking with such intensity that it affected everyone in proximity, knocking out consciousness in some, triggering psychotic breaks in others, creating chaos that spread through Mount Massive's restricted wings like a cascade failure. In the confusion, Father Martin seized his opportunity, leading his followers in a coordinated uprising that had clearly been planned for weeks, overwhelming staff, seizing control of key areas, releasing patients from locked wards. Within hours, Mount Massive Asylum descended into complete chaos, the patients taking control of most areas, staff members fleeing or being captured, the normal order that had maintained Murkoff's operations disintegrating into nightmare. Murkoff's response to this catastrophe revealed the corporation's priorities. Rather than immediately seeking to rescue remaining staff or contain the situation, they implemented lockdown protocols that sealed Mount Massive completely, trapping everyone inside, and began planning not rescue but cover-up, determining that the asylum's exposure would be more damaging than the loss of everyone within its walls. The corporation quietly contacted private military contractors to eventually neutralize the situation, but in the meantime, Mount Massive was left to its own devices, a contained hell where Father Martin and his followers began implementing their vision of divine purpose, where Billy Hope remained trapped in the underground laboratory in some kind of catatonic state from which he still generated his morphogenic field, the living engine, whose presence continued affecting everyone in the facility. Father Martin, now fully in control of large portions of Mount Massive, set about preparing what he called the gospel, converting the facility into a cathedral of his twisted faith, leaving messages and makeshift shrines throughout the asylum that explained his vision of Billy as divine instrument and the uprising as sacred duty. He organized his most devoted followers into what he termed apostles, individuals whose engine-damaged minds had aligned with his religious interpretation, who helped him maintain order within the chaos and prepare for the arrival of what Martin prophesied would be the witness, someone from outside who would document the revelation and carry the gospel's message to the world beyond Mount Massive's walls. By late September 2013, Mount Massive Asylum had become a place beyond conventional reality. The combination of Billy's uncontrolled morphogenic field and decades of engine exposure affecting the facility's entire population, creating what witnesses would later struggle to describe, a pocket of warped perception where hallucinations became semi-tangible, where the boundaries between individual consciousness grew thin, where the accumulated psychic trauma of thousands of victims seemed to have saturated the environment itself. Some staff members who survived the initial uprising but remained trapped in hiding spaces reported experiences that defied rational explanation, suggesting that Billy's influence had created conditions where normal physics and psychology no longer fully applied. Into this nightmare arrived Miles Upshur, a freelance investigative journalist who had received an anonymous email in late September 2013, a message from someone identifying themselves as a Murkoff whistleblower, providing coordinates for Mount Massive Asylum and claiming that the corporation had been conducting illegal human experiments for decades, that terrible abuses were occurring behind the facility's walls. Miles, driven by journalistic principle and the promise of a story that could make his career, made the decision to investigate despite the clear dangers, packing his camera and notebook, and driving through the Colorado mountains toward the asylum, arriving after dark on September 18th. The facility looming against the night sky like a monument to darkness. Miles's first moments inside Mount Massive revealed the aftermath of the uprising. Corridors splashed with blood, bodies of staff members left where they had fallen, signs of violence and chaos everywhere. The journalist's investigation led him to the security office where he restored power to large sections of the facility, inadvertently illuminating the nightmare and attracting attention from the asylum's inhabitants. Miles began encountering patients who responded to his presence with immediate violence, forcing the unarmed journalist to flee and hide, using parkour skills and quick thinking to evade pursuers through Mount Massive's labyrinthine corridors. His camera, his only weapon, documentation, his only purpose. Father Martin made contact with Miles in the asylum's chapel, appearing suddenly with an unsettling calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos elsewhere. The priest explaining in his gentle, mad voice that Miles was the witness he had prophesied, the outsider who would document the gospel. Martin spoke of divine purpose and necessary suffering, making clear that Miles would serve the priest's purposes whether he chose to or not. As Miles descended through Mount Massive's levels, he encountered various patients who had claimed different areas as territory. In the showers, he met Chris Walker, a massive former military police officer who had been admitted to Mount Massive for severe PTSD and subjected to years of engine exposure that transformed his trauma into homicidal obsession. Walker pursued Miles with single-minded determination, his engine-damaged mind fixated on containing the breach and eliminating security risks. Miles's journey took him through the asylum's medical wing, where he discovered extensive documentation of Murkoff's experiments, files detailing the Morphogenic Engine program's history, patient records showing decades of abuse justified as research. The journalist documented everything with his camera, building a case that would expose Murkoff even as he struggled to survive the immediate threats surrounding him. The deeper levels brought Miles to the underground laboratory complex where Dr. Wernicke had conducted his most extreme experiments, where Billy Hope lay in his catatonic state connected to monitoring equipment that still functioned despite the facility's collapse. In the underground laboratory, Miles encountered evidence of Billy Hope's unique condition, research notes describing the young man as a living morphogenic engine whose neural activity generated electromagnetic effects that influenced everyone in proximity. Miles also discovered references to the whistleblower who had contacted him, a Murkoff software engineer named Waylon Park, who had been working at Mount Massive on security systems, who had sent the email that brought Miles to the asylum in hopes that an outside journalist could document what Park himself couldn't safely reveal. Navigating the underground complex, Miles encountered Dr. Richard Traeger, the psychiatrist who had taken over Mount Massive's operations after Wernicke's death. Now revealed as a patient himself, his mind fractured in ways that preserved his sadistic intelligence while removing all restraint or empathy. Traeger captured Miles with disturbing efficiency. His territory in the laboratory complex equipped with surgical tools and restraints. The doctor's madness focused on transformation and perfection. The journalist found himself strapped to a wheelchair, Traeger approaching with evident pleasure, explaining his plans to remove Miles's fingers one by one. Miles's escape from Traeger required desperate ingenuity, the journalist fleeing through the laboratory complex with 2 fingers missing from his left hand, eventually leading the doctor into an area where industrial equipment crushed Traeger's body. Wounded and exhausted, Miles pressed forward through the underground levels, following Father Martin's directions toward the area where Billy Hope remained in his mysterious catatonic state. In the deepest level of the underground complex, Miles finally reached Billy Hope's location, finding the young man suspended in a strange apparatus surrounded by monitoring equipment and electromagnetic generators, his unconscious form the source of the intense field that permeated the entire facility. Father Martin appeared again, explaining with terrible satisfaction that Billy was the vessel, the living engine whose suffering and power would enable the transformation he had prophesied, that Miles's role as witness required him to activate the final systems that would push Billy's abilities to their absolute limit, releasing what Martin called the Walrider, an entity the priest described in religious terms as an angel of death. Though documentation Miles had found suggested the Walrider was actually a Murkoff project, an attempt to weaponize morphogenic effects by creating a swarm intelligence controlled through Billy's consciousness. Miles, realizing the danger but seeing no other path forward, made the choice to activate the systems as Martin directed. The activation sequence initiated, power flowing to Billy's apparatus, his comatose form convulsing as the systems pushed his already overtaxed neurology to new extremes. And from his location emerged what witnesses would struggle to describe: a cloud of darkness that moved with evident intelligence, a swarm of nanomachines made visible by their density and unified by Billy's consciousness projecting through them, the Walrider taking form as Father Martin watched in religious ecstasy. The Walrider's emergence transformed the underground complex into a killing ground, the entity moving through corridors and rooms with terrifying speed, tearing apart anyone it encountered. Father Martin became one of its first victims, dying in apparent rapture, his faith validated even as the Walrider eviscerated him. Miles fled upward through Mount Massive, the Walrider pursuing intermittently, its attention drawn by other targets but always returning to the journalist. Chris Walker made a final appearance, attempting to stop Miles from escaping, but the Walrider intervened, tearing Walker apart with casual efficiency. Reaching Mount Massive's exit, Miles found his escape blocked by armed Murkoff security personnel who had finally arrived to contain the facility, tactical teams positioned to prevent anyone from leaving, their orders clearly to eliminate all witnesses. The journalist found himself trapped between the Walrider behind him and Murkoff's soldiers ahead. In the final confrontation, Murkoff's forces opened fire on Miles as he emerged from the facility, their bullets tearing through his body, the journalist falling as his camera slipped from his grasp. But as Miles lay dying, the Walrider engulfed him, the entity merging with his failing body in ways that suggested Billy's consciousness had chosen the journalist as new host. The nanomachines swarm entering Miles's wounds and spreading through his system, keeping him alive through mechanisms that defied biology, transforming him into something between human and entity. The merged being rose despite mortal injuries, and in this state the journalist turned on Murkoff's forces, the entity expressing through his body to tear through tactical teams with the same efficiency it had shown against the asylum's inmates, their weapons proving useless against something that existed partially in the nanoscale realm. The Walrider possessed Miles, carved through their positions and disappeared into the Colorado night. Even as these events concluded at Mount Massive, another story had been unfolding in parallel, one that would reveal additional layers of Murkoff's crimes and provide testimony that Miles's death had seemingly prevented. Waylon Park, the software engineer whose whistleblower email had brought Miles to the asylum, had indeed been captured by Murkoff security shortly before the September uprising, his attempts to leak information discovered by the corporation's internal monitoring. Rather than simple termination, Murkoff decided Park would become a test subject himself. Admitted to Mount Massive under false psychiatric evaluation, subjected to the engine's influence as both punishment and opportunity to study morphogenic effects on someone with detailed knowledge of the facility's operations. Park's admission occurred just days before Father Martin's uprising. The engineer finding himself trapped in the asylum's intake processing when chaos erupted, his fortune or misfortune placing him inside Mount Massive just as it descended into nightmare. But before the engine had significantly damaged his psychology, leaving him more cognitively intact than most inmates but equally trapped. Navigating Mount Massive's sublevels, Park encountered evidence of the engine program's depths. Experiment logs describing decades of torture, patient files documenting lives destroyed in the name of research. The guilt transformed into determination. Park resolving that if he somehow escaped, he would ensure this evidence reached authorities who couldn't be bought or intimidated by Murkoff. Park's flight through the asylum brought him into contact with Eddie Gluskin, a patient whose history of childhood abuse had been amplified by morphogenic exposure into an obsession with gender, marriage, and violent transformation of others to match his fractured vision of domestic perfection. Gluskin had claimed the asylum's vocational block as his territory, converting workshops into horrific mockeries of wedding preparation. Eddie captured Park with disturbing efficiency, planning to transform him into his bride through forced surgery, but Park's escape required exploiting Gluskin's obsession with proper wedding protocol, eventually leading to the patient's death in industrial equipment. Escaping Gluskin's territory, Park made his way toward Mount Massive's administration area where he knew security stations contained external communication equipment that might still function. Using his security credentials, Park accessed communication equipment and began uploading files to external servers, sending documentation of the engine program to multiple destinations including mainstream media outlets, federal agencies, and international human rights organizations, ensuring redundancy that would make suppression difficult even for a corporation as powerful as Murkoff. The upload's completion coincided with the Walrider's emergence in the underground complex, causing electromagnetic disturbances that rippled through Mount Massive's systems. Park realized his window for escape was closing, that Murkoff's response teams would arrive soon to contain the facility. Fleeing toward Mount Massive's exits, Park encountered scattered groups of surviving staff members and less violent patients, people who had hidden during the worst of the uprising and now sought escape. The exit attempt brought Park and his group to a loading dock area where they found one of Murkoff's transport vehicles. The group piled into the vehicle, Park taking the driver's seat, engines starting just as Murkoff's security forces arrived in force. The van crashed through partially erected barriers, taking small arms fire as Park navigated the mountain roads while armed vehicles pursued. The pursuit continued for miles down the mountain, Murkoff's vehicles gradually falling behind as Park's desperate driving and the van's armor allowed survival, until finally the engineer reached areas where civilian traffic and populated zones made continued armed pursuit impossible without exposure that even Murkoff couldn't risk. Park immediately contacted federal authorities, identifying himself as the Murkoff whistleblower and demanding protection. His uploads from Mount Massive now serving as insurance against simple elimination, the evidence already spread too widely to suppress, even if the corporation silenced him personally. In the weeks following the Mount Massive incident, as Park gave testimony to federal investigators and international media outlets reported on Murkoff's crimes based on his leaked documents, the corporation mounted desperate defense, lawyers and public relations specialists working to characterize the allegations as conspiracy theories unsupported by credible evidence, attempting to discredit Park as a disgruntled employee with vendetta. The strategy achieved partial success. Murkoff's political connections and financial resources, allowing them to avoid immediate criminal prosecution, investigations bogging down in jurisdictional disputes and classification issues as government agencies that had originally contracted with the corporation found themselves implicated in the crimes they were supposed to prosecute. Mount Massive Asylum itself was sealed and placed under federal quarantine, officially due to biological contamination, though Park's testimony suggested the real reason was preventing further documentation of evidence that remained inside. The facility left abandoned with its surviving inmates trapped or deceased, Billy Hope's fate uncertain, the young man possibly still alive in his catatonic state in the underground laboratory, his Walrider entity having disappeared into the surrounding wilderness still merged with Miles Upshure's corpse or transformed body, reports of mysterious deaths and disappearances in the region leading to speculation that the entity remained active. While Mount Massive's horrors reached their conclusion and Wayland Park's whistleblowing began exposing Murkoff's crimes to limited public awareness, the corporation had been simultaneously pursuing other projects in different locations, experiments that built on decades of morphogenic research but took it in directions that would only become clear when catastrophe struck once again. In rural Arizona, far from Colorado's mountains, Murkoff had established Temple Gate School, but the facility's most significant subject, Jessica, had already met her tragic end years before these events. In the years following Jessica's death, Blake Langerman's guilt and unresolved trauma from the Temple Gate School incident affected his marriage to Lynn, creating distance between them that both struggled to bridge, his obsession with the memory of the girl he'd failed to help contrasting with Lynn's desire to move forward. They attempted to repair their marriage through their continued work as documentary filmmakers, pursuing projects that examined institutional failures and vulnerable populations, Blake's drive to expose corruption and abuse channeling his guilt into productive action. In early 2016, Blake and Lynn Langerman accepted assignment to document the supposed murder of a pregnant woman in the remote Arizona region known as the Sonoran Desert, reports suggesting a cult or religious community might be involved. The story promising exactly the kind of institutional abuse and failure that had driven their work since Temple Gate School. The couple traveled to the area with their camera equipment, conducting interviews and gathering footage, their investigation leading them to rumors of a settlement called Temple Gate, the name's echo of the school where Blake had witnessed Jessica's ordeal, creating uncomfortable resonance, but also deepening his determination to expose whatever was happening in this isolated community. Blake and Lynn's investigation brought them to the outskirts of Temple Gate, a community of religious extremists led by a man called Sullivan Knoth, a charismatic preacher whose apocalyptic theology had attracted followers who'd abandoned conventional society to prepare for the end times in the Arizona desert, and building a settlement that mixed 19th century aesthetics with modern survivalist paranoia. The couple managed to make contact with the community despite its insularity, presenting themselves as documentarians interested in alternative lifestyles, hoping to gain access that would reveal whether the rumors of the pregnant woman's murder had foundation in reality. What Blake and Lynn didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Templegate existed under Murkoff Corporation's shadow, that the settlement's location had been deliberately chosen by the corporation to serve as testing ground for a new application of morphogenic technology, that towers hidden in the surrounding landscape housed equipment generating electromagnetic fields that bathed the entire area in engine influence. A massive experiment examining how morphogenic effects could be used to control entire populations rather than just isolated subjects. Sullivan Knoth himself had been exposed to engine influence during the settlement's founding. His already extreme religious beliefs pushed into apocalyptic madness by Murkoff's technology, his sermons growing increasingly violent and paranoid as the corporation's towers broadcast their signals. His followers' devotion deepened beyond normal cult dynamics by electromagnetic effects that suppressed critical thinking and enhanced suggestibility. The pregnant woman whose murder had brought Blake and Lynn to the region had been one of Knoth's followers, a victim of the prophet's interpretation of divine command. His engine amplified madness, convincing him that all children born in Temple Gate represented potential vessels for the Antichrist, that preventing apocalyptic corruption required murdering infants and pregnant women. The woman had attempted to flee Temple Gate when she realized Knoth intended to kill her unborn child, but the prophet's enforcers had tracked her down, her murder carried out according to rituals that Knoth claimed God had revealed to him. Blake and Lynn's arrival at Temple Gate came just as Knoth's paranoia reached new heights, the prophet having received what he interpreted as divine revelation that outsiders would come bearing false witness, that the end times approached. The couple's cameras and questions marked them immediately as the prophesied threat, Knoth's followers surrounding them with sudden hostility. Confiscating their equipment and separating them, Blake dragged to one location while Lynn was taken elsewhere. The settlement's facade of religious community dropping to reveal the violent cult beneath. Blake found himself imprisoned in Temple Gate's crude jail, a structure that spoke to the settlement's rejection of modernity even as it served the same brutal purposes as any prison. Through the cell's small window, Blake could observe Temple Gate's daily life continuing, followers going about their tasks with the mechanical dedication of the faithful, but their movements and expressions suggesting something wrong beneath the surface, and uniformity that went beyond normal religious conformity. Escape from the cell came through unexpected means when Marta, who served as Knoth's primary enforcer, arrived to execute Blake in what she believed was holy duty, her massive form and crude pickaxe making clear her role as Temple Gate's instrument of violence. Blake's survival hinged on luck and desperation, managing to evade Marta's initial assault and flee into Temple Gate's labyrinthine structures. Fleeing through Temple Gate, Blake witnessed horrors that confirmed the settlement's dark nature. Crucified corpses displayed as warnings, followers engaging in self-flagellation, and other acts of mortification that Knoth had declared necessary for spiritual purification, children separated from parents and subjected to indoctrination that erased their individual identities. Blake's search for Lynn led him deeper into Temple Gate's territory, following fragmentary clues and overheard conversations that suggested she had been taken to Knoth's chapel, the settlement's spiritual center. As Blake and Lynn fled through the settlement after he managed to find and rescue her, the filmmaker began experiencing vivid hallucinations, visions that initially seemed like stress responses or trauma-induced flashbacks but grew increasingly intense and immersive, pulling him into detailed recreations of his past, specifically his memories of Catholic school and the events surrounding Jessica at Temple Gate School 13 years earlier. These visions weren't simple recollections, but fully realized perceptual experiences that replaced current reality temporarily. Blake finding himself back in school corridors, reliving conversations and moments with Jessica, the memories mingling with distortions and nightmare imagery. The hallucinations intensified as Blake and Lynn progressed through the settlement, Blake's perceptions sliding between present danger and past trauma with increasing frequency, the boundaries between memory and reality growing porous in ways that made it difficult to maintain coherent responses to immediate threats. Lynn tried to ground him during these episodes, her presence and voice serving as anchors that pulled him back to present moment. What Blake didn't understand was that Murkoff's towers surrounding Temple Gate generated morphogenic fields that didn't affect all individuals equally, that his particular neurology and his unresolved trauma from Jessica's death created vulnerabilities that the engine's influence exploited, pushing him into dissociative states where his consciousness became unmoored from present reality. The couple's flight eventually brought them to the settlement's outskirts where Murkoff's towers stood exposed. Massive structures that should have seemed out of place in Temple Gate's deliberately archaic landscape, but that Knoth's followers appeared not to notice. Blake, during moments of clarity between hallucinations, recognized the towers as artificial constructs that seemed to pulse with energy, that emitted low humming, that felt like it resonated in his skull. Before Blake could investigate the towers further, Marta appeared again, her pursuit having continued without pause. Her engine amplified devotion, making her literally tireless in service of Knoth's commands. The confrontation forced Blake and Lynn to split up, attempting to divide Marta's attention, Blake leading the enforcer away from his pregnant wife. The chase led Blake into the surrounding wilderness, Marta pursuing through desert landscape and abandoned structures that suggested Temple Gate had expanded and contracted over its history. In one of these abandoned areas, Blake finally turned to confront Marta, improvising weapons from debris and using the environment against her, eventually managing to cause structural collapse that crushed Marta beneath rubble, her final moments spent in prayer rather than attempts to save herself, her faith maintained even as her body was destroyed. Returning to the settlement to find Lynn, Blake discovered that Knoth had recaptured her, so that the prophet had taken her to the chapel for what he announced as final purification. His paranoid theology convinced that Lynn's pregnancy represented the Antichrist's imminent birth, that preventing apocalypse required killing her and the child she carried. Blake's infiltration of the chapel came too late to prevent violence, arriving to find Lynn having given birth in circumstances that mixed Knoth's brutal ceremony with medical complications from the stress and trauma. Her body weak from blood loss and shock, the infant she had delivered lying still and silent in ways that suggested it had not survived the birth or had been killed immediately after, Knoth standing over the scene with satisfaction that his prophecy had been fulfilled. Blake's confrontation with Knoth occurred amid the chapel's chaos, followers gathering to witness what their prophet declared was Temple Gate's ultimate victory. But before Knoth could order Blake's execution, the prophet experienced catastrophic psychological break, his engine-sustained madness collapsing as some critical support failed, his consciousness fragmenting in front of his followers as he began ranting incoherently about God's abandonment, about his visions having been lies, about demons winning despite his efforts. In his final moments of lucidity, Knoth recognized that Temple Gate had been built on delusion, that his certainty about divine purpose had been madness amplified by forces he didn't understand. The prophet's suicide followed this recognition using the same blade he had employed to kill infants. His death simultaneously attempt at atonement and final expression of his damaged theology. Knoth's death triggered cascading collapse among Temple Gate's followers, their engine maintained devotion losing its focal point, their suppressed consciousnesses beginning to emerge from morphogenic control now that the charismatic center that had organized their beliefs had been eliminated. Some fled into the desert, abandoning Temple Gate entirely, unable to process their complicity in the prophet's crimes. Others simply collapsed into catatonia, their consciousnesses too thoroughly broken by the combination of religious control and morphogenic manipulation to function without external direction. Blake, cradling Lynn's dying body as her blood loss proved fatal despite his desperate attempts at first aid, experienced his most intense hallucination yet, his perception completely detaching from present reality as the engine's influence and his own trauma combined to create vision where past and present memory and fantasy merged into singular experience that his consciousness couldn't categorize as real or unreal. In this final vision, Blake found himself back at Temple Gate School, witnessing Jessica's death from new angles, understanding elements that he couldn't have known during the original event. The vision resolved into Blake holding his daughter, the child that Lynn had delivered appearing alive and healthy in his arms. Despite his earlier observation of the infant's stillness, his perception now showing him caring for the child in Temple Gate's ruins, the settlement having transformed from place of horror to peaceful haven. The dawn light washing over structures that no longer seemed threatening but instead comforting. Whether this represented genuine happy ending, with the earlier horrors having been engine-induced hallucination and this reality being true, or whether Blake had descended so deeply into morphogenic-induced delusion that he could no longer perceive the truth of his situation, remained ambiguous, his consciousness having been so thoroughly compromised that determining what had actually happened versus what his damaged mind constructed became impossible. As Blake sat in Temple Gate's ruins with what he perceived as his family, as the sun rose over the Arizona desert, Murkoff personnel arrived to begin cleanup operations, corporate teams tasked with sanitizing the settlement and eliminating evidence of the corporation's involvement. The teams found bodies throughout Temple Gate, Knoth's victims and his followers who had died in the collapse following his suicide, evidence that would be documented in classified reports and then buried. Blake's fate in Murkoff's hands remained uncertain in documented records, whether he was killed to eliminate a witness or captured for study as someone who had survived extended engine exposure in unique circumstances, or simply ignored as too damaged to pose credible threat. The settlement itself was eventually destroyed, structures burned or demolished, the land restored to empty desert, Murkoff's towers dismantled and removed, their existence denied in official documentation. Even as Temple Gate's horrors reached their conclusion in the Arizona desert, Murkoff Corporation continued operations in other locations. The exposure of Mount Massive and the catastrophe at Temple Gate representing setbacks that required adaptation rather than termination of morphogenic research. The corporation shifted strategies, moving from isolated facility experiments toward more distributed approaches that learned from both their successes and their spectacular disasters. One of Murkoff's most ambitious post-Temple Gate projects emerged in the form of what they designated the Trials, a program that built on everything the corporation had learned about morphogenic influence but applied it in structured environment, designed to create useful subjects through managed trauma. The Trials operated from a massive underground complex constructed in remote location, a bunker that could house hundreds of subjects and staff in complete isolation from external oversight, where experiments could proceed without the risk of whistleblowers or regulatory interference that had compromised earlier operations. The Trials program recruited subjects through deception rather than simple kidnapping, targeting desperate individuals who responded to advertisements for experimental psychological studies that promised substantial payment, participants signing waivers that buried Murkoff's actual intentions in legal language too complex for most to parse. Subjects who arrived at the Trials facility found themselves trapped, their voluntary participation revealed as permanent commitment once they entered the underground complex. The Trials themselves represented systematic application of engine technology combined with behavioral conditioning. Subjects exposed to morphogenic fields while being forced through scenarios designed to break down existing personality structures and rebuild them according to Murkoff's specifications, creating individuals whose consciousness responded predictably to corporate direction without the psychotic breaks and violent instabilities that had characterized earlier subjects. Unlike Mount Massive's chaotic patient population or Temple Gate's religious devotion, the Trials aimed to create subjects who retained high functionality while being reliably controllable, individuals who could operate in normal society while serving Murkoff's purposes through morphogenic influence that activated under specific conditions, sleeper agents whose programming lay dormant until needed. The program's success validated Murkoff's decades of research, finally producing the results that had justified the suffering of thousands, proving that morphogenic technology could achieve the control that governments and corporations had sought since the Cold War's paranoid beginnings. That human consciousness could be reliably hacked and reprogrammed through the right combination of electromagnetic manipulation and psychological conditioning. The trial's graduates moved through society as unknowing weapons, their presence undetectable except to those who knew the activation protocols, their lives serving purposes they couldn't consciously acknowledge. As the two monies progressed, as Wayland Park's initial whistleblowing from Mount Massive faded from public attention, as Temple Gate became footnote in histories of cult violence without acknowledgement of corporate manipulation, as the trials produced their controlled subjects and deployed them across society in service of Murkoff's expanding influence, the corporation's leadership looked toward future applications that would extend morphogenic control from individual subjects to entire populations. These ambitions remained largely theoretical, requiring technological advances in social conditions that hadn't yet materialized. But Murkoff's leadership remained committed to the vision that had driven the engine program since Wernicke's first experiments. And somewhere in this world of expanding morphogenic control, scattered survivors carried their traumas forward, individuals whose encounters with Murkoff's experiments had marked them irrevocably. Wayland Park continued his efforts to expose Murkoff through legal channels that moved with bureaucratic slowness, while the corporation's lawyers delayed and obfuscated, his whistleblowing having achieved limited impact, but at least preventing complete suppression of the truth. His testimony ensuring that some record existed of Mount Massive's horrors, even if broader public remained largely ignorant or indifferent. Blake Langerman, if he had survived Temple Gate with his consciousness sufficiently intact to function, carried his memories of Lynn's death and Jessica's trauma, his mind forever shaped by the engine's influence during his time in Knoth settlement, his perception of reality permanently compromised in ways that made his testimony unreliable, even to himself. The trial's graduates moved through their lives unaware of their conditioning, living as ordinary citizens whose consciousness carried hidden architecture that Murkoff could activate when needed. Their relationships and achievements real but also somehow false. Their apparent autonomy masking deeper reality of their status as corporate assets. And Miles Upshur, if anything remained of him within or alongside the Walrider entity that had merged with his dying body on Mount Massive's threshold, existed in some liminal state between human and morphogenic weapon, his consciousness possibly persisting within the nanomachine swarm, his journalist's need to document and expose, perhaps finding expression through the Walrider's attacks on Murkoff facilities and personnel in the years following his transformation. Billy Hope's fate remained one of the timeline's most tragic mysteries, the young man whose entire existence had been consumed by Murkoff's experiments, whose childhood had been stolen for morphogenic research, whose unique neurology had transformed him into living engine, possibly still alive in Mount Massive's sealed underground laboratory, possibly dead from the strain of generating the Walrider, possibly existing in some state between life and death that his morphogenically altered biology made possible. Father Martin's vision of apocalyptic revelation had been both wrong and right. His religious interpretation of morphogenic effects misunderstanding the technology while correctly identifying its world-changing implications. His prophecy of transformation more accurate than he knew, though the changes he foresaw were coming slower and more subtly than his damaged consciousness had imagined. Sullivan Knoth's death had ended Temple Gate's particular nightmare, but validated the methods that Murkoff had tested in his settlement, proving that morphogenic technology could control religious populations through amplification of existing beliefs rather than creation of entirely new consciousness. Dr. Rudolf Wernicke's legacy persisted decades after his death, his vision of morphogenic control having shaped Murkoff's research agenda, and by extension, having influenced the trajectory of human enhancement and consciousness manipulation across the late 20th and early 21st century. centuries. His name largely unknown outside classified documents, but his impact rivaling that of more celebrated scientists. As this dark history unfolds toward uncertain future, as Murkoff continues its research and deploys its technology, as survivors carry their traumas and morphogenic effects ripple through society in ways most people never consciously recognize, the fundamental questions that Outlast's timeline raises remain unresolved. What does it mean to be human when consciousness itself can be hacked and reprogrammed? What happens to concepts like free will and moral responsibility when electromagnetic fields can shape thoughts and behaviors? How does society function when institutions possess the means to control populations at the neurological level? And what hope exists for justice or accountability when the very crimes being committed operate at scales and through methods that make them literally unbelievable to those who haven't experienced them firsthand? The answers to these questions remain uncertain. The timeline's conclusion open-ended not because the horrors have ended, but because they continue, evolving and spreading, Murkoff's ambitions advancing despite exposures and catastrophes that would have destroyed less determined organizations. And so the timeline continues forward into darkness, into a future where the engine's influence spreads further, where more lives are consumed in pursuit of perfect control, where human consciousness becomes increasingly colonized by technologies designed to override rather than enhance it. Yet within this darkness, small lights persist. Survivors who remember and resist despite the weight of institutional power arrayed against them. Whistleblowers who choose conscience over career. Victims who refuse to be silenced even when their testimony is dismissed as delusion or conspiracy. The scattered evidence of Murkoff's crimes persists in fragmentary forms. Wayland Park's leaked documents circulating among researchers and activists who understand their significance, even if mainstream institutions dismiss or ignore them. Survivor testimonies recorded and preserved even when they seem too extreme for general credibility, patterns in unexplained deaths and disappearances that suggest Murkoff's continued operations even if direct proof remains elusive. Legal cases wind through courts with glacial slowness, Murkoff's resources allowing them to delay and obfuscate indefinitely. But each case represents lives that refuse to be forgotten, voices that insist on being heard, a gradual accumulation of testimony that someday might reach critical mass and force accountability that currently seems impossible. As the timeline approaches present day and extends toward uncertain future, the stories of Mount Massive Asylum, Temple Gate, and the trials facilities serve as warnings, case studies, in what happens when technological capability advances faster than ethical wisdom, when institutional power operates without meaningful oversight, when human consciousness becomes resource to be exploited rather than sovereignty to be protected. These stories resist comfortable conclusions, refusing to offer reassurance that justice prevails or that victims receive vindication. Instead, presenting the harder truth that abuses of power continue until actively stopped, that accountability requires sustained effort and willingness to confront institutions that would prefer their crimes remain buried. In the quiet that follows this examination of Outlast's dark timeline, in the space where horror gives way to reflection, perhaps the most important understanding is that these stories, while fictional in their specific details, reflect patterns that extend beyond games into the actual world, echoes of real experimentation and exploitation that have characterized human institutions' treatment of the vulnerable throughout history. The engine, in this reading, becomes metaphor as much as fictional technology, representing all the ways that institutions seek to shape and control consciousness. From propaganda and advertising to education systems designed to produce compliant workers rather than independent thinkers. Survivors like Wayland Park remind us that resistance remains possible even from positions of apparent powerlessness, that individual choices to expose wrongdoing matter even when immediate consequences seem minimal, that the accumulation of testimonies and evidence gradually shifts what institutions can maintain as secret or deniable. Miles Upsher's fate, transformed into or merged with the Walrider entity that may continue his mission through violence that transcends human capability, suggests both the fantasy of perfect justice enacted against those who evade conventional accountability and the tragedy of losing one's humanity in pursuit of truth and vengeance. Blake Langerman's uncertain fate. His consciousness compromised to the point where he cannot reliably distinguish reality from engine-induced delusion, embodies the psychological destruction that morphogenic influence inflicts, the loss of the very faculties needed to understand and resist what has been done. Billy Hope's tragedy, his entire existence consumed by experimentation that transformed his childhood into extended torture, and his unique neurology into weapon that he never chose to become, represents the ultimate cost of treating human beings as means rather than ends. As we reach the end of this complete chronological journey through Outlast's world, as the timeline's threads draw together in their incomplete and unsettling conclusion, what emerges is less a story than a warning, less entertainment than examination of humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty when institutions operate without meaningful oversight and when technological capability advances faster than ethical wisdom to guide its application. In the darkness of these tales, in the suffering of Mount Massive's patients and Temple Gate's victims and the trial's subjects, perhaps the essential truth is simply this: that human dignity requires constant defense, that power without accountability inevitably becomes abusive, that technological advancement must be guided by ethics rather than allowed to proceed according to its own logic. The timeline continues forward beyond this telling. Murkoff's operations proceeding, new victims entering facilities where their suffering will advance research that serves purposes they don't understand, survivors carrying their traumas into futures shaped by experiences they can barely articulate. The slow work of accountability, grinding forward through legal systems and journalistic investigations and activist pressure that may eventually force reckonings or may simply dissipate against institutional resistance. As these dark waters close over the timeline's final moments, as the stories settle into memory like sediment drifting toward ocean floors, let the narrative wash over you one final time, the complete chronology of suffering and resistance, of institutional cruelty and individual courage. The engine's hum continues in facilities hidden from oversight, electromagnetic pulses shaping consciousness according to specifications written by those who will never experience their effects. Subjects strapped to tables or wandering through trial scenarios, or sitting peacefully in homes unaware that their thoughts are not entirely their own. Against this darkness, small lights persist. Individuals who choose to document and expose despite the dangers, who refuse to forget victims that institutions would prefer to bury, who insist that human dignity matters more than technological advancement or corporate profit. In this quiet ending, in this space where horror gives way to stillness, let the timeline rest, the complete chronology told, the warning delivered, the choice offered between complicity and resistance. The stories of Mount Massive, Temple Gate, and the trials facilities echo forward into uncertain futures, their warnings available to those willing to hear them. Their victims demanding recognition even if institutions refuse accountability. Their survivors insisting that truth matters even when speaking it carries costs that safety would avoid. Sleep now, if sleep will come, carrying these dark truths into dreams where perhaps meaning emerges from horror, where patterns become clear that remained obscured in the timeline's progression, where the warning finds purchase in consciousness that daytime certainties might dismiss, but that nighttime honesty cannot quite reject. The timeline is complete, the chronology told in full, every thread woven through from Cold War origins to present-day uncertainties and future fears, from Wernicke's first experiments to the trial's refined control, from individual tragedies to institutional patterns, the warning delivered for those willing to hear it, the darkness documented for those brave enough to witness it. Let it settle now into the quiet, the complete story of Outlast's world, a cautionary tale for our own, echoing softly into sleep's approach. The final truth, as dark and simple as the waters that close over Mount Massive's ruins, that human consciousness remains contested territory, that the battle for its sovereignty never truly ends, that eternal vigilance represents not paranoia, but appropriate response to institutions that would exploit any opening to extend their control. The timeline ends here, in this quiet moment of reflection, carrying its warning forward into whatever futures await, the stories told completely, the victims honored through testimony even if justice remains elusive, the pattern recognized even if solutions remain uncertain. Rest now. In whatever peace this darkness allows, the complete timeline of Outlast told from beginning to present, the warning delivered, the choice offered, the truth spoken into silence that may receive it or may simply absorb it, like all the other voices crying out against institutional evil, but spoken nonetheless because silence equals complicity, because victims deserve witness, because the future's shape depends on whether enough people choose to care about suffering that doesn't directly touch them. This is the complete timeline, every shadow explored, every victim acknowledged, every warning delivered. Let it carry you toward whatever rest awaits, the stories settling into memory where they will either fade or take root depending on choices not yet made. Sleep now. The timeline is complete. The warning has been delivered. The rest, as always, is up to those who choose whether to hear it.